Hello, I'm Anastasia Edmiston, and I'm here to talk about strategies and accommodations that can be very simply used to help support people who are living with a brain injury, be it a traumatic brain injury from an external force, like a car accident or a fall, or if somebody's been abused or assaulted. And then there's another type of brain injury we often refer to as acquired brain injury, and that can happen to somebody they've had a stroke or they've had an aneurysm or they've lost oxygen to their brain, and there's a number of ways that can happen. It can happen from a heart attack, so oxygen is cut off from the brain during the attack. It can happen when somebody has survived an overdose of drugs. Specifically, we in the brain injury community are seeing this among folks who have survived an opiate overdose or overdoses. So acquired brain injury and traumatic brain injury may have different causes, but they often have similar consequences. So this video is going to talk about how can you support people. You don't have to do a full neuropsychological evaluation to understand that these universal supports can help people living with really any kind of cognitive thinking and often behavioral issues related to a brain injury of any kind. So I'm, again, Anastasia Edmiston, and I am a rehabilitation counselor, and I've worked in the field of brain injury rehabilitation and brain injury services for 35 years or so. So this is what I picked up over that period of time. So some of the strategies that I'm going to cover today, and this by no means is a complete list of strategies, but I like to think of them as ways of supporting people across their thinking ability. So many folks living with brain injury will have problems with their frontal lobe functioning. So your frontal lobe is the biggest lobe in your brain, and it's the seat of your adult thinking. And that means it helps you navigate the world. It helps you make good decisions. It tells you when to keep your mouth shut when you should. It helps you to keep your hands to yourself when you should. And it's a part of the brain that doesn't fully become mature until you're in your mid-20s. So if somebody has had a brain injury, say early in their life, they may grow up with a disadvantage of not having that frontal lobe be fully functional. But they could look like anybody else you see on the street and not think twice about. They do not look like they're living with an obvious disability. So folks living with brain injury with disabilities related to their executive functioning, and that is the part of our cognitive toolkit that resides in our frontal lobe. So I'm just going to go through very quickly some of the areas that strategies and accommodations can support. And I mentioned that frontal lobe at the onset because that is really the most vulnerable part of your brain. And if you have any injury to that part of your brain, be it from a lack of oxygen, be it from a blow to your head, shaken baby, shaken adult, whatever it is, that very large part of your brain could be damaged, and you might have some issues that lead you to difficulty navigating the world. So let's talk about memory, because that is probably the most common recognized for people living with brain injury. They may not be aware of every issue they're having, but memory is very commonly a problem that people will talk about. You know, I go into my room and I think I'm gonna do something, and I get there and I don't know what I went there for. So memory, attention, which is related, so our ability to focus and really pay attention and take in what we're seeing or what we're hearing or what we're reading, the ability to take it in with our attention and concentration and then hang on to it, that's all part of that memory loop. And if we're not able to take in information, make good sense of it, and then respond to it, either in the moment or later on, that really puts us at a disadvantage. It makes it difficult to interact with people. It makes it difficult to organize ourselves. It makes it difficult for us to initiate. So for example, if somebody has difficulty organizing themselves on the job, they may be able to do the first task that they've been assigned, and then they sit down. And that looks like they're lazy or not motivated, when in fact, they don't have the ability to keep in their mind what was that second step that their supervisor told them to do. And instead of the supervisor saying to themselves, well, I guess he's living with a brain injury, let me put in some strategies and accommodations, that supervisor may say, lazy worker, not motivated, and the person who, many people living with brain injuries don't recognize that the trouble they're having is related to a very long ago brain injury. And so they end up getting mad at the supervisor for writing on them. And so you have somebody who may just quit their job or get fired. So the other thing I want to mention, and there's quite a few on this list, but I want to hit the major ones that really translate to behavioral issues and relationship issues and functional issues, and that is inflexibility. So this is related to that frontal lobe impairment that I mentioned earlier. So it can look like the person is stubborn, rigid, unable to listen to another person's point of view. And that inflexibility is in fact related to our friend the frontal lobe once again. So it's the inability to look at alternative points of view, alternative ways of managing a situation, and it can come across as my way or the highway, again posing a barrier for folks at work, at home, in the relationships. So I don't want to excuse people's kind of bad behavior sometimes that can result, but I do want to explain it. And if your frontal lobe was injured, especially at an early age, when the part of the brain that starts to develop that allows you to navigate the world as an adult, by the time you get to 13, 14, 15 and beyond, you're beginning to pick up how you navigate and how you work with other people. And if that brain had been injured earlier, it's not able to step up to the plate. So again, a person may exhibit signs and symptoms of somebody, say, with mental health issues or a personality disorder or just a real pain in the neck. But in fact, it could be related, that inflexibility, that inability to come up with plan B, to be flexible in your thinking, things that we adults do every day. That can be a challenge. And it doesn't look like a diagnosable issue, illness. It looks like a personality problem. So I'm going to move on to the next part that I wanted to address, and that is the interpersonal skills. And I think hopefully I set this up for you, that a lot of these cognitive issues translate into interpersonal problems. So people can be very impulsive. Again, I sound like a broken record, but that frontal lobe is so key to our ability to stop ourselves so that we don't put our foot in it. Basically, we don't offend people. Say you don't think that dress is doing her any favors, but you're not going to share that. I've worked with people for many years who've had this issue, and I would just say to them, keep it in the vault. Nobody needs to hear your opinion on that. So that is really hard for people living with brain injury, and so they may say or do things. Sometimes it's just a social faux pas. Sometimes it really can pose a danger to them if it happens when they're, say, interacting with a member of law enforcement in the community who approaches them and asks them a question. And instead of saying, officer, how can I help you? They become overwhelmed with emotion and fear, and their frontal lobe isn't enough on the job to say, hold back, just wait for the officer to speak and then respond. So again, a lot of these cognitive issues translate into interpersonal issues. The inability to tolerate frustration. I just mentioned that organizational and executive skill function. If somebody's living with a brain injury and really tried hard to put together a plan for themselves, looked really good, or they anticipated an interaction with somebody in their life and they thought they knew how it would go and they felt real comfortable, and then they go to either execute the plan or have that interaction with a person in their life and it doesn't go the way they planned, that may lead to a flooding of emotions and somebody like getting really angry or very upset. It could be crying, it could be yelling, storming out of a room, storming out of therapy, storming out of rehabilitation for recovery for addiction. People living with brain injuries oftentimes are not able to engage in therapy and recovery services because of some of these issues. So it really does pose barriers. With social skills, especially for folks who were injured at a young age and never learned the niceties and the subtleties of engaging with different kinds of people. So in my past, I've worked as a job coach and employment specialist, and one young man just wanted to hug his supervisor day one. So that's not something that we recommend as an employment specialist. And so I literally had to come up with a system of touching his arm very subtly when I started to see him kind of moving towards that. So those are the kind of things, again, that can get folks in trouble, not being able to read other people's nonverbal signals. So maybe I'm sitting at my desk and I look like I'm working real hard, or I'm on the phone, and somebody that I'm working with in program will come barging into my office because they have something to say. And if I didn't know that they were living with a brain injury, I might be afraid they'd forget what they need to say to me. I would perceive that as being very rude. So to redirect that person and say, look at the clues, I'm working, I'm on the phone, what you have to say must be important. Why don't you go in the other room, write it down, and then we'll talk. So again, these problems can really have a negative feedback loop, and the world that doesn't understand, even family members. You know, maybe they know intellectually, but to live with somebody who is constantly, being a little rude and insensitive can be really wearing on that relationship. And so that person's getting negative feedback from the world, and you start to feel pretty bad about yourself. And so again, those relationships become frayed, and it's hard to build new relationships. So our folks oftentimes are very isolated and because of that. So let's move on to what do you do about this? There's two kinds of strategies. There's environmental. So environmental strategies and internal aids. So I'm going to go to the environmental first because that's the easiest to picture. The environmental is just putting signs up. The environmental is making sure that you're labeling things for folks. So there's an employment specialist that I know, a colleague, and he describes a gentleman whose goal was, I just want to empty my dishwasher in under an hour. That was, you might think, oh my gosh, what do you mean he can't empty his dishwasher, in less than an hour? It's because he couldn't remember where everything went. And so very simply, he and his employment specialist made labels and put them on the cabinets and on the drawers, and then they kind of made it a game. How quickly can I put away my clean dishes and silverware? And he mastered that. So that was in place, and over time, he got real good at emptying his dishwasher, and hopefully he was able to take that strategy and apply it to other parts of his life. So that's a very concrete strategy, and I'll talk a little bit more. And then the internal is, it's in your head. You think about it. You're being mindful about something. So the example that I like to use is from our friend, the actor George Clooney, who is himself living with a brain injury. And I'm not outing him. It's been in the papers. It's been over 10 years now, but he did injure himself while filming a movie, and subsequently received some services for the hit to his head. And his memory had been affected. And as an actor, you can imagine how difficult that was for him to learn his scripts. And so he learned from his speech therapist, and rehab professionals, I imagine, that one strategy is to be focused and to repeat things. And so he calls it his memory muscle, which I think is a great way of referring to that internal process. So he counts everything, like how many times I pedal when I'm on a bike. I imagine that over time he's had to do that less and less because the brain recovers, continues to grow new neurons. And so he's doing quite well as far as I can see, and so that's just one example of an internal strategy. So again, the external, and another term that our occupational therapy friends refer to it as, is prosthetic external memory. So in other words, just structuring the environment. So you change it or modify it for that person. Other ones, aside from labeling your kitchen cabinets, is to use a journal or a calendar to create a schedule. So I would always tell the folks that I worked with that before you go to bed, write down or put it into your device your schedule for the day. Or if it's already in there, to review it and do the same thing when you wake up in the morning. Break tasks into small, manageable steps. So a very simple example, if you're cleaning out your closet, take care of the shoes first. If that's all you do that day, that is fine. Then the next day you're going to work on the sweaters. So you break things down so you don't become overwhelmed. I worked with a young lady. She was taking care of her elderly parents. She had pretty poor organization and memory issues. We created a blueprint of her brownstone where she lived in Brooklyn, New York, and we had a rotation of what rooms she was going to take care of for each day of the week. So she had a structure, she had a schedule, and she had a plan, and she was able to keep a good house, which was very important to her. Using digital recorders, smart devices. So back in the day, I would tell my clients to call their home answering machine if they wanted to remember something when they got home. Now we have these wonderful brains in our pockets, and there's free recording devices, and all you need to do is tap on that app and make a few comments, and you can send it to yourself an email or send it to somebody else. So this has been really a game changer for people with cognitive issues, because back in the day, I would give people these huge 3-ring binders and say, here's your memory, and they would say, thanks, but no thanks. And they would literally, I had to fish them out of trash cans, because these were adults I worked with, and it felt very stigmatizing to have to carry around their schedule and other things in a big giant notebook like a kid. That's often the feedback I got. But now we all are carrying these around. And so there's a lot of what we call face validity. You know, nobody knows it when they're looking at their phone, they're reviewing what they're doing the next hour. So it's really a game changer. The other thing that people living with brain injuries often tell us is that they get tired. Some people are really good in the morning and then they're done by noon. Sometimes it's dependent on their medications. There's some medications that can make people sleepy, and maybe that's cause for a discussion with their doctor to maybe arrange the dosing. So one person I worked with, they wanted to work in the morning. They worked in a school situation, but they were so tired. So she worked with her doctor and was able to change her medicine from 3 times a day to a time-release dose at night, once a day. And that enabled her to be a little bit more alert and to work the hours that she wanted to. Napping is fine, no shame in napping. For people living with brain injuries, a nap can be so critical, because most of us, brain injury or not, when we're tired, we're not at our best. And the bar's set a little low sometimes for folks living with brain injury. They get there quicker than the rest of us do in terms of feeling tired and overwhelmed and frankly irritable. So I will always say to folks, there's no shame in taking a brief power nap and wake up feeling refreshed. And then accepting coaching from others. So this is, I think, part of really engaging with people, asking their permission. You know, I think I might have some suggestions that can make your day and your life a little bit easier. What do you think? What are you doing already to get yourself through your day? When do you feel most lost? And so if people know that you want to act as an ally and as somebody who is working with them, not kind of for them or to them, that can really help. And we call that the therapeutic alliance. And you don't have to be a therapist or a doctor to have a therapeutic alliance with somebody. It just means that they trust you, you trust them, and you can come together and develop a plan for what works for them. It could be in the moment, it could be over a long period of time, it could be certain situations and not others. But it's really important to have permission before you start bestowing your wisdom. And then generalizing strategies into new situations. So the gentleman with the dishwasher, for example. So maybe there's other things in his world that have been difficult because of his brain injury. you might think, well, he's going to do that same strategy for, I don't know, writing out his bills every month. Don't assume that. You got to check it out. You got to see if he needs a structure or a template to do that and to do it efficiently. So people with brain injuries famously have difficulty at times generalizing from one place to another. So it's just some real quick tricks that are useful, or that I found useful when working with people over the years. So red, so the color red. Obviously our stop signs are red, and there's a reason for that. It's a color the eye is drawn to. So if somebody is living with visual impairment secondary to their brain injury, some folks have what we call a neglect, so they might not see out of one part of their visual field. Simple, cheap trick is to get an index card, mark one edge of it in a red marker, and then ask that person, try pulling that red across the page. Pull it all the way to the left if you're having trouble reading, and then as you read the sentence, you're just going to push that red line. It's really so easy, and I've worked with so many people who have found that so helpful. And over time, and so I'm going to talk about internal strategies a little bit more in a few minutes, but over time, for example, one man who had this issue with reading was able to eventually, it was tattered and pretty worn by the end, but he's like, I don't need this anymore, Stacia, and he threw it away. He had learned internally that I need to turn my head to make sure I take in the full visual field. Alarms. So we used to, back in the day, have to use these very complicated watches, which I never was able to master myself, but now we have phones. Again, one more way that technology helps support people living with brain injuries. Use of a template. So I kind of referred to that already, but that means, for example, when I've done job coaching, let's not reinvent the wheel every day. If you have a certain thing that you need to do, like one young woman processed instruments coming in from emergency rooms and operating rooms at a major medical center. And each of the origins of the instruments had a different procedure to go through, central sterile, which is where she worked. So we created a notebook. And so if it came in from the orthopedic surgery, then it had a certain order that she had to process those instruments. And when she left that job, her supervisor said, can I make a copy of this so I can train the next employee? So it's really not just for people living with brain injuries. We all can benefit from this, so we can free up our brains to do new and novel things and not get bogged down in routines. Earplugs are really helpful because a lot of us work in cubicles, or we have office mates who are on the phone. So for people living with brain injuries, that can even be more distracting to work in that kind of setting. So earplugs are really, really useful. Partitions at work and at home, a quiet space to kind of regroup, all those can be valuable. And then again, modeling, it's part of reinforcing the template. So as we put together for that young woman the routines for processing the operating room equipment, we modeled it, and then she took it over and was able to master it. So I mentioned that red-lined index card. It also helps with attention and concentration because, again, it helps give people a point of focus. So it has multiple uses. I can't say enough good things about the color red. It can be used as a reading guide, and then another thing people can do, you grab a manila folder. You take your scissors or an X-Acto knife, if you got it, and you create a window in that folder of maybe 1/4 of an inch by 8 to 12 inches. It's a window, and they can put the text, they can put it over the page, and they pull it through. So they read one line at a time. They don't get distracted. It really helps focus concentration. And then for people, especially folks who've had a stroke, they may have paralysis on one side of their body, not able to use their arm functionally. What if that was their dominant side? So they may have difficulty even eating a bowl of cereal. So with one arm, and so to use something called DICEM, which is our occupational therapist, that's one of their favorite things. It's something you can get on the internet at this point in time. It's basically a yoga mat for your kitchen table, and you can put a piece of paper down if you're doing some writing, or if you're eating and you don't want your plate to go flying off on you. So all these things can really help folks, just day-to-day basic stuff. Using pictures, that's also very useful, and now we have these cameras in our phones. So things like, I'm going to the mall and I get lost in the mall. I park and I swear to myself, I know where I'm going to go. I know where I'm parked when I come back, and then I come back and oops, don't know where my car is. And so you take out your phone and you take a picture. I used to tell people to write it on their hands, C4 West. Now they could just take a picture and refer to that and not get lost and frustrated, angry, and upset by the time the security guard comes over and asks what's wrong. Using a timer to track breaks at work. Time management is a pretty common problem with folks living with brain injury. So to be able to track their breaks, again, will help make them better employees and not tick off their coworkers who think they're gaming the system by taking that 25-minute break when really there's only 15 minutes. The other thing, you might not be familiar with this term, it's a time minimum technique. So oftentimes that impulsivity that I mentioned earlier can cause people to make careless errors. Even though they're very familiar with the material, they're really bright, they know the answer, but they don't take their time, and so they make careless errors. This can really affect people if they go back to school, mastering a new task, trying to get through something. So again, using our handy dandy phone, I used to have people carry around a kitchen timer. Don't need to do that anymore. You take your phone out and you set the alarm, and you make sure, if say for example it's working on, let's say you really want to get your GED, and you're doing those practice manuals, and your instinct post-brain injury is just to whip through that to show how smart you still are, because that's taken a hit, your self-esteem in that area. But you find you're making a lot of errors on those tests. So what you might want to do is set your alarm on your phone for 10 minutes, and you're not going to take that pencil off that worksheet until that alarm goes off. So again, that helps you focus, be mindful. And then the fun thing about this is that over time, with folks that I've worked with, we would coach them, okay, we're getting rid of the timer, all right, and now we want you just to write in fake pencil at the bottom, go over your work. And then eventually it's internal, and they're able to do that on their own. And then I've also used it when people want to complain, because we all have, issues, but we're not going to do it in front of our supervisor. And so we will set aside, and 10 minutes, you got to tell me all your woes, and then we're done. The last bullet on this slide is for people's quality of life, reading, books. Using the subtitles when watching a movie can be really useful for folks. Using an audiobook to follow along while you're reading on the page. So all these things can really help people enjoy the things that maybe they did before their injury. This is just a mnemonic that Dr. Rick Prente and his colleague Douglas Herman included in their book, Retraining Cognition, Techniques and Applications. And it's been around for a while, but these lessons still hold. Some people really do well with what's called a mnemonic. So it's goal, and then each letter stands for something. So I'm not going to go too much into detail because it's pretty self-explanatory, but some people I've worked with, this really helps anchor the important part of kind of setting up their day and reviewing their goals. Other strategies recommended from Prente and Herman include consistency. Don't be running around looking for your keys every day. Have a place for your keys. You come in the door, you put your keys in there. Things that are used together, keep them physically close. So for example, in my kitchen, I keep my immersion blender and my food processor and my other blender in the same cabinet. So I know where they are and to think twice about it. Put things in distinct locations. So I'm not going to put my mail in my closet with my coats. So keep things separate, group them. And then put things where you need them. So cooking utensils near the stove. So you might want to have a little rack where you put, talking about my own kitchen here, but I have a rack where I have my spoon and my stirrers, and they're all hanging there right by the stove where I use them. So I'm not running around saying, which drawer is that in? So by structuring your environment, you will free up your brain space to focus on maybe acquiring new skills, to have new experiences, and it will free up your focus so that you can open yourself up and be less frustrated. So I think it's a win-win for your family, so they're not always talking you off the ledge, and for you to develop some competencies. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about what Mr. Clooney said, and that is the internal strategies. So those are the ones that are in your head. So other things around internal strategies could include visualization for faces, a route, a room, where things are in your house. Be mindful. So I famously will just throw my keys hither and yon in my purse. So I have learned to practice what I preach and say, as I'm putting my keys, I'm putting that in the front pocket. I actually say that to myself. And it's amazing how that does stick. So I automatically reach for my keys in the front pocket of my purse without having to root around when I need my keys. Applying new information to old information. So meeting somebody for the first time, and this can be any of us. You don't have to be living with a brain injury to have some shallow new memory issues, especially as we age. So you meet a Nancy, and you're like, am I going to remember this in this big group of people? Then, boy, one of your best friends in high school was Nancy. So you just take a little mental picture of the new Nancy, and hopefully you will remember when you see her again, you know, at the bar or wherever. Subvocalization. So this is an excellent strategy, and I know teachers recommend kids do it as well when they're learning how to read. But just say the text to yourself very, very softly to reinforce what you are reading or what you're hearing. And if you're doing that with somebody who doesn't know you, you might say, I just want to give you a heads up. It's really helpful for me to repeat information back to myself. So I'm not having a conversation with just nobody. I'm just helping myself remember that your name is Nancy. Practice, practice, practice. The people I used to work with in an outpatient program would just roll their eyes at me because I would say, you just got to reinforce it, you got to review it, you got to repeat it. But it works. It's called procedural learning. And I've already alluded to this, but the cool thing about environmental strategies is that they so often will become absorbed, become second nature, and become internal strategies. One thing, if you're working with individuals that you might want to try is we would do groups where people would actually get up and give a speech to their peers, and they would start the process by writing it down. And again, that impulsivity I mentioned earlier, if they just wrote it down and then went up and delivered the speech, chances are they'd talk so fast. If they were somebody with a frontal lobe issue that impacted their ability to be measured and to be calm and take things at a good pace, nobody would understand what they were saying. Nobody could get a word in edgewise. And so we would put red hash marks in the text. Some pushback, well, that's stupid. Why would I do that, Stacia? Well, it's going to cue you to take a breath at the end of that sentence or two. And that will allow you an opportunity to look at the audience, see if they're with you, see if anybody has a question. And again, over time, hopefully that translates to situations where you can't stand there with a piece of paper with hash marks. I'm meeting somebody after my nephew's baptism. I want to make sure that I don't monopolize the conversation and potentially embarrass myself or be seen as a rude, obnoxious person. So I am going to take a breath, and I'm going to see those red marks in my brain, and I'm going to take that breath and let that person ask me a question. So again, it can all transfer to those internal strategies. So some of the strategies that could help for physical barriers imposed by a brain injury, speaking for myself, I have trifocals to accommodate for my visual issues. Very common. people living with brain injuries, they may have a prism lens. So a prism lens is a really cool technique that eye doctors will use. Put on someone's lens, it looks like a diamond cut, and that helps them with double vision. I don't understand the science, but it really works. So that's a really good example of somebody using it's pretty simple actually, strategy to compensate for a physical barrier related to a brain injury. So I don't want to talk too much about the physical because a lot of those are pretty self-explanatory. People use canes, people use hearing aids. Those are all pretty common. I really want to focus more about how this can translate interpersonally. So oftentimes, even well-meaning professionals will say, oh my God, he's so narcissistic. All he does is talk about himself. Like, remember, this person's living with a brain injury. He may look so good, quote unquote, but it's really hard for him or her to kind of edit themselves in the moment. So my former supervisor used to call it a noisy listener, and she'd say to folks that worked with us in our program, no one likes a noisy listener. So again, using those internal hash marks, and also to be able to educate other people. You know, I don't mean to be rude, but sometimes I get a little nervous, and it's hard for me to kind of take a breath. So, and if you feel comfortable enough, you can coach the person to say to folks, maybe in their families, you know, let me know when I'm going a little overboard. Other things that can be helpful are simple relaxation techniques. So taking in a breath over time, say 6 beats, breathe in slowly, you hold it for 6 beats, and then you let it out. And that really does calm down your nervous system. So that's doing it old school, but there are breathing to relax apps on the phone, which are free. So that's another way people can ground themselves and kind of pull themselves together if they're feeling a little overwhelmed. So paraphrasing during conversations is a really easy thing to do. We all probably do it without thinking. People living with brain injuries are feeling so bad about the barriers that they're now experiencing that they oftentimes feel very self-conscious using some of these strategies, but I always try to assure people, trust me. If you paraphrase back to your supervisor, so Denise, what you want me to do is A, B, C. I'm going to write this down and make sure I got it, put it in my phone. They will be grateful. And as somebody who has worked in employment services, I've had more than one supervisor say, boy, he really listens to me. I wish everybody did that. So it really can work in your favor, even though you feel a little awkward and self-conscious at first. And again, those breaks and pauses. And if you are somebody working with somebody who's living with a brain injury and you understand them to be having issues with listening and taking in new information, you yourself can use these strategies. You know, speak in short, simple phrases, and then rephrase what you're saying maybe more than one way. Just be mindful that chances are you're talking to a fellow adult, so you're not going to talk to them like they're 3. You're going to talk to them like an adult. Use your language, use your big adult words, but just break it down, slow it down, and check in to make sure that the person's following you. Other things that folks can do is jot down notes. Now, again, I should be getting some money from Apple, but you can put it in your phone and your notes, just that important information. Some people carry a little flip notebook that you can get at the drugstore for $50. And then when you're giving somebody instructions, if at all possible, do it verbally, in writing, and when, again, possible, model the task. So going back to the emptying the dishwasher situation, the employment specialist modeled it, so put the labels up and then showed the person, here I'm going through the silverware first, put the silverware away. So this is a word that we don't care for. When people use it towards us, you're being inappropriate. There's nothing good about that. That says that I'm being rude, that says that this person is upset with me. And it's a word that sometimes us professionals we'll toss around when referring to people that we're serving, and we probably should try to keep it out of our vocabulary because it doesn't help. What you want to say is very specific feedback about the behavior. So as I said, sometimes folks have a hard time keeping their hands to themselves post-brain injury. And as an employment specialist, I really try to increase their awareness of that tendency before I put them on a job site and they got in trouble. So there was a gentleman who liked to pick at my sweater in group. He thought it was his job to take the pills off. And so instead of saying, "Oh my gosh, why are you touching me?" And I said to him, if you were sitting on a bus, that would be the response. I said, "That makes me uncomfortable. Why do you think that makes me uncomfortable? I'm wondering why you're doing that." And really broke it down, and it really was he had a terrible frontal lobe injury, and he said, "I know I shouldn't do it, but I can't help myself." And so we had to really go step by step. When the thought comes to mind, hold your hands in your lap. And he was able to internalize that eventually. Again, we're all adults here. Talk to people like they're adults. And again, ask permission. I notice sometimes you interrupt during group. Before we go into group this morning, can I give you a signal? What if I just wink at you, or I go like this, and that will let you know. And maybe the first time we run this strategy, maybe I sit next to you and I can just tap you on your elbow. And then eventually, hopefully, the person will catch themselves. So you got to be clear in your expectations. Give feedback immediately. So if somebody did something that was out of line, I wouldn't have a conversation a month later, a week later, a day later. I would do it in the moment. So a gentleman interrupted a group to say that he could see how many gray hairs I had in the light in the room. And the other women in the group were quite offended on my behalf, and I did a different spin on it because his goal was to initiate. His goal was to say 1 or 2 things per group. Now what he said was not appropriate. There's that word, not appropriate, but it wasn't consistent with the topic, which was employment. And so, we all had a good laugh, and he was embarrassed. I said, it's fine, because you said something. So that's the feedback sandwich. You said something, that's your goal, that is great. What you said, and here's the hummus in the sandwich, what you said really wasn't relevant to this discussion. It was kind of a personal question to me, and not really something the group is here to talk about. And then, you don't want to embarrass people, but I will be making that appointment with my salon. And then the other thing, the next part of the sandwich is, I am so glad you said something. I'm wondering if we could kind of have a do-over, and here's what we're talking about. Do you have something to say about this topic? So the feedback sandwich can be really powerful because you don't want to shame people. Again, we're working with adults, and they're not to be infantilized. They're not to be spoken down to. We have to give people positives wherever we can find them. It's so powerful. This is not always something that can be done easily depending on your setting, but if you are working with somebody in a program or in a residence, sometimes putting things in writing is really helpful. And I don't like to call it a contract because that kind of sounds punitive. I just call it agreement. This is our working agreement that you're not going to touch my sweater during group. Is that okay with you? That's fine with me, Stacia, and the sign on the dotted line. And then that is something that they have with them and they can refer to and update it as needed. So again, I cannot repeat enough. You can roll your eyes just like the people I used to work with. You have to repeat, repeat, repeat. That's how we learn things. And I would say just think back to the time you learned how to ride a bike or to tie your shoe. You had to practice it a few times, and it was so hard at first. But eventually, you were able to internalize it. So it is called procedural learning for those who want to throw around the fancy neuropsychological term. But this is one strategy all of us use. We never probably think about it. But it's so powerful for folks. And even people who have really big barriers in their learning and their memory, if the neuropsychologist, if they were fortunate enough to have an evaluation, can say in their report, this person has the capacity for procedural learning, that person can work. So to close out, I just have a few examples just to kind of illustrate some of my points. So the rude housemate. So I was speaking to a group of residential they were residential case managers. They work with people who were living in group homes. And it was for folks living with intellectual disabilities, but they did have a gentleman who had a brain injury before he became an adult. And this gentleman would barge into his roommates' rooms uninvited. Well, how rude is that? They were so mad at him. They didn't want him to be in their house anymore. There was a mutiny going on, and the staff didn't know what to do. And I said, well, can he read? Nope, can't read. So I guess they already thought of putting his name on his own door. See, he was going into his roommates' rooms because he didn't remember where his room was. So I said, can he recognize pictures? Oh, I think so. Do you think he knows his own face? Probably. Can you take a picture and put it on his door? Ask him if that's okay first. And then if it is, why don't you try that? Oh, so simple. Now, I did the training and then I was gone. So I don't know how the story ends. I'm trying to be optimistic. I hope it ended well for that gentleman, because that would make such a difference in his ability to maintain and maybe make new relationships among his housemates. The hasty accountant. So this is the story I talked about, the trying to pace yourself, the time minimum technique. This was a gentleman who used this technique, and believe me, he wasn't happy about it. He was so bright. His math skills were off the charts. We had a special educator on staff who was able to assess him, and but the occupational therapist and everybody else is like, but he makes all these mistakes. He wants to go back to school. He wants to be a bookkeeper. There's no way, Stacia, he can do this. And I'm thinking, but on testing. So that's the disconnect with people living with brain injuries. They can look so good on paper, but then in the real world, that frontal lobe involved issues, they can interfere. And so we use that time minimum. The occupational therapist said, again, we're going to put this timer on and you are not going to pick your pencil off. Oh, this is stupid. This is dumb. Throwing the pencil across the room. Nope. You know me, right? I haven't steered you wrong yet, she says to him. And because they had that therapeutic alliance, he gave it a shot, grumbling and mumbling and cursing the whole time. But eventually he was able to internalize that strategy. His accuracy on his work was perfect, and he went back and got his AA degree and is now working. So, and this is a gentleman who had a pretty significant brain injury. Lobster toast, I'm going to skip over the appropriate young man because I've already told you about the pills. That was the gentleman I was thinking of. The lobster toast. This is a pretty illustrative story of the rigidity and flexibility that some people can have after brain injury. So I started a new job, employment specialist, and a cohort had just left the program, a group of individuals, and had gone to work. And my job, first thing I was going to do, first week, was to call and see how people were doing on the job. So this one individual in particular, I was given his chart, and my supervisor said to me, yeah, he's working at a law firm and he's doing some administrative stuff, and he lives in an apartment over a Chinese restaurant, and he gets the same lobster toast for dinner at this restaurant every day. Looking at that through a brain injury informed lens, I'm like, he's really rigid. He's inflexible. He likes his routine. Maybe he's got some memory issues. Good to know. So I call his supervisor. Hi, I'm Stacia. I'm following up, see how John's doing. Oh, we're going to fire him, he says to me. I'm like, what? First day on the job. Because, it's all about me. But then I pull myself together and I said, thinking about the lobster toast. I said, well, why don't you tell me about what's going on? And so he said, well, we give him work to do. He's got a station. He's supposed to staple, collate, copy. And I said, well, who's giving him these tasks? Oh, and this is a huge law firm in Manhattan. Oh, the lawyers, the secretaries, the paralegals. And so I envisioned this young man just being overwhelmed by piles of paper and verbal instructions that he could not keep on top of. And what he was doing and why he was at risk of losing his job was he was starting to curse at people as they came at him with work. And so I said, can one person kind of put this work in order of importance for him, kind of put it in order. He said, well, we'll try that. Let's call back a week later. How's he doing? Oh, he's fine. That's all he needed. He needed the structure imposed for him, and once he had that, he was able to do the work beautifully. Awkward social scenes. So I cannot tell you how many times I have been asked if I'm pregnant when I have not been pregnant. Usually it was right after I had a baby and had gone back to work, and at a gathering of family and participants of the program, a young man said quite loudly, "When's your baby due?" And I said, well, I just had one, and I also happened to have a plate full of cookies. And he's like, well, girl, put down those cookies. You're just getting fatter. And because I knew that this young man was living with a serious brain injury, I did not get upset. Maybe I was a little embarrassed, but I said, is that something you really meant to say? And the minute the words came out of his mouth, he started to look real sheepish, and his mother was mortified. And I said, it's okay. We all think these things, and you're probably right. Maybe I should put the cookies down. But that's something we keep in the vault, right? And he's like, yeah. And then he did. He looked at me sometimes, and then he kept it to himself. The passionate reader. So a woman that had a brain injury, she came into services, and she did so well. And she felt a little kind of sheepish saying this to me, given the great reports she was getting from the therapy. She said, Stacia, I love to read. And I'm like, yeah, great, so do I. What's the issue? She said, my mind's eye is gone. And I had to think about that for a minute. She was like, I can read it, I'm mostly remembering it, but I don't have the pictures of what I'm reading in my mind. And it makes it less joyful for me to read. And so I put my head together with my supervisor, and we thought, well, why don't we give her pictures? It may feel artificial, but it's a start. So we suggested that she take a short book that a movie's been made out of. We used fried green tomatoes because it's a very short novel. And the movie was out and could be gotten from the back then video store. And so she did that. She rented the movie, she watched the movie, then she read the book. And she said that really, really helped. So that's just a really simple way to help folks and do something that's part of their life, quality of life. Close call with our Baltimore police. A young man, 3 brain injuries. He was somebody, and at this point I've been in the field for decades. And I knew what was going on with him. Multiple injuries at a young age. Inability to read other people, inability to convey his own feelings nonverbally. And so what he did was he gave you a hard stare, no matter what you were saying to him. And when someone gives you a hard stare, even though intellectually you know they don't mean you any harm, it can still generate some anxiety. Even me in the field for so many years, I had to tell myself, this is part of his disability. So he was working with a support person in his home in the neighborhood. He was actually in front of his aunt's house, who was next door to him. And this is, in a neighborhood in Baltimore City. And there was a police helicopter overhead. And most of us would go, wonder who they're looking for. And just kind of be on, just be kind of forewarned. And so a police cruiser, pulled up in front of the house. And the young man didn't yell for his support person. He just stood there with a hard stare. The officer approached him, hard stare. There's 2 hard stares going on. And instead of saying, officer, how can I help you? He could not behave in a way that was in his own best interest and started challenging the officer, who started challenging him. They got closer. Hand was on the weapon on the officer's part. And thankfully, the worker saw what was going on and came out, and he said, officer, this young man's living with a brain injury. And the officer, to his credit, stepped back and said, thank you for letting me know. This is why we're in the neighborhood. Thank you. But without the worker, I don't know how that would have ended. So this happens to our folks a lot. And I'm not excusing, behavior that's not cool, but I am explaining it. So we just need to be mindful that sometimes it's not always a nefarious motivation. So that's all I have to say about strategies and accommodations. There's more information for you on this last slide, and I hope you find this useful with the folks that you are working with. Thank you.